I love the way Janie Crawford left her husband's Emergent Female Hero by Mary Helen Washington. Read by Richard M. Thompson, aka Ion Dreams. I love the way Janie Crawford left her husband's Emergent Female Hero. In the past few years of teaching Zora Neale Hurston's Their Eyes Were Watching God, I have become increasingly disturbed by this text, particularly by two problematic relationships I see in the novel: women's relationship to the community and women's relationship to language. Their Eyes has often been described as a novel about a woman in a folk community, but it might be more accurately described as a novel about a woman outside of the folk community. And while feminists have been eager to seize upon this text as an expression of female power, I think it is a novel that represents women's exclusion from power, particularly from the power of oral speech. Most contemporary critics contend that Janie is the articulate voice in the tradition, that the novel celebrates a woman coming to self-discovery, and that this self-discovery leads her ultimately to a meaningful participation in Black folk traditions, perhaps. But before bestowing the title of Articulate Hero on Janie, we should look to Hurston's first novel, Jonah's Gourd Vine, to its main character, Reverend John Pearson, and to the power that Hurston is able to confer on a male folk hero. From the beginning of his life, John Pearson's relationship to the community is as assured as Janie's is problematic. Living in a small Alabama town and then in Eatonville, where Janie also migrates, he discovers his preaching voice early and is encouraged to use it. His ability to control and manipulate the folk language is a source of power within the community. Even his relationships with women help him to connect to his community, leading him to literacy and to speech, while Janie's relationship with men deprive her of community and of her voice. John's friendship with Hambo, his closest friend, is much more dynamic than Janie and Phoebe's, because Hurston makes the male friendship a deeper and more complex one, and because the community acknowledges and comments on the men's friendship. In his introduction to Jonah's Gourd Vine, Larry Neal describes John Pearson's exalted function in the folk community. John Pearson, as Zora notes in her letter to James Weldon Johnson, is a poet, that is to say, one who manipulates words in order to convey to others the mystery of that unknowable force which we call God. And he is more, he is the intelligence of the community, the bearer of its traditions and highest possibilities. End quote. One could hardly make such an unequivocal claim for Janie's heroic posture in Their Eyes. Singled out for her extraordinary anglicized beauty, Janie cannot get but so close to them, the people in Eatonville, in spirit. Her friendship with Phoebe, occurring apart from the community, encapsulates Janie and Phoebe in a private dyad that insulates Janie from the jealousy of other women. that insulates Janie from the jealousy of other women. Like the other women in the town, she is barred from participating in the culture's oral tradition. When the voice of the black oral tradition is summoned in their eyes, it is not used to represent the collective black community, but to invoke, valorize the voice of the black male community. As critique Margaret Hammonds points out, our attentiveness to the possibility that women are excluded categorically from the language of the dominant discourse should help us to be aware of the inadequacy of language, its inability to represent female experience, its tendency not only to silence women but to make women complicitous in that silence. Part of Janie's dilemma in their eyes is that she is both subject and object, both hero and heroine, and Hurston apparently could not retrieve her from that paradoxical position except in the frame story where she is talking to her friend and equal, Phoebe Watson. As object in that text, Janie is often passive when she should be active, deprived of speech when she should be in command of language, made powerless by her three husbands and by Hurston's narrative strategies. I would like to focus on several passages in Jonah's gourd vine and in their eyes to show how Janie is trapped in her status as object, as passive female, and to contrast that and to contrast the freedom John Pearson has as subject to aspire to an heroic posture in his community. In both their eyes and in Jonah's gourd vine, sexuality is established in the early lives of Janie and John as a symbol of their growing maturity. The symbol of Janie's emerging sexuality is the blossoming pear tree, being pollinated by the dust-bearing bee. Early in the text, when Janie is about 15, Hurston presents her stretched out on her back beneath a pear tree, observing the activity of bees. Quote, she saw a dust-bearing bee sink into the sanctum of a bloom. The thousand sister calyxes arc to meet the love embrace and the ecstatic shiver of the tree, from root to tiniest branch, creaming in every blossom and frothing with delight. So this was marriage. She had been summoned to behold a revelation. Then Jenny felt a pain, remorseless, sweet, that left her limp and languid. End quote. She leaves this scene of the pear tree looking for an answer seeking her, and finds that answer in the person of Johnny Taylor, who, in her rapturous state, looks like a golden, glorious being. Janie's first sexual encounter is observed by her grandmother, and she is summarily punished. To introduce such a sexual scene at the age when Janie is about to enter adulthood, to turn into romantic fantasy, and to make it end in punishment certainly limits the possibility of any growth resulting from that experience. John's sexual encounters are never observed by any adult, and thus he is spared the humiliation and the punishment Janie endures for her adolescent experimentation. In an early scene when he is playing a game called hide and switch with the girl in the quarters where he works, he is the active pursuer. And in contrast to Janie's romantic fantasies, John's experience of sexuality is earthy and energetic and confirms his sense of power. Quote, when he was it, he managed to catch every girl in the quarters. The other boys were less successful, but girls were screaming under John's lash behind the cow pen and under sweet gum trees around the spring until the moon rose. John never forgot that night. Even the strong odor of their sweaty bodies was lovely to remember. He went into bed when all the girls had been called in by their folks. He could have romped till morning. End quote. A recurring symbol Hurston uses to represent John's sexuality is the train, which he sees for the first time after he meets Lucy, the woman destined to become his first wife. A country boy, John is at first terrified by the panting monster, but he is also mesmerized by this threatening machine whose sides seem to expand and contract like a fiery lunged monster. It looks frightening, but it is also a pretty thing, and it has as many destinations as John, in his philandering, will have. As a symbol of male sexuality, the train suggests power, dynamism, and mobility. Janie's image of herself as a blossom waiting to be pollinated by a bee transforms her figuratively and literally into the space in which men's action may occur. She waits for an answer, and the answer appears in the form of two men, both of whom direct Janie's life and the action of the plot. Janie at least resists her first husband, Logan, but once Jody takes her to Eatonville, he controls her life as well as the narrative. He buys the land, builds the town, makes Janie tie up her hair, and prescribes her relationships with the rest of the town. We know that Hurston means for Janie to free herself from male domination, but Hurston's language, as much as Jody's behavior, signifies Janie's success as an object. Janie's arrival in Eatonville is described through the eyes and speech of the men on the front porch. Jody joins the men, but Janie is seen through the bedroom window getting settled. Not only are Janie and the other women barred from participation in the ceremonies and rituals of the community, but they become the objects of the sessions on the porch, including in the men's tell-tailing as the butt of their jokes, or their flattery, or their scorn. The experience of having one's body become an object to be looked at is considered so demeaning that when it happens to a man, it figuratively transforms him into a woman. When Janie launches her most devastating attack on Jody, in front of all the men in the store, she tells him not to talk about her looking old because when you pull down your breeches, you look like the change of life. Since the change of life ordinarily refers to a woman's menopause, Janie is signifying that Jody, like a woman, is subject to the humiliation of exposure. Now that he is the object of the gaze, Jody realizes that other men will look on him with pity. Janie had robbed him of his illusion of irresistible manliness that all men cherish. Eventually, Janie does speak, and interestingly, her first speech on behalf of women is a commentary on the limitations of a male-dominated society. Quote, "Sometimes God gets familiar with us women folks too, and talks his inside business. He told me how surprised he was about y'all turning out so smart after him making y'all different, and how surprised y'all's going to be if you ever find out you don't know us half as much about us as you think you do." End quote. Speech does not lead Janie to power, however, but to self-division and to further acquiescence in her status as object. As her marriage to Jody deteriorates, she begins to observe herself. One day she sat at and watched the shadows of herself going about, tending store and prostrating itself before Jody, while all the time she herself sat under a shady tree, with the wind blowing through her hair and her clothes. In contrast to Janie's psychic split in which her imagination asserts itself while her body makes a show of obedience. John Pearson, trapped in a similarly constricting marriage with his second wife, Hattie, experiences not self-division but a kind of self-unification in which the past memories he has repressed seeped into his consciousness and drive him to confront his life with Hattie. Then, too, his daily self seemed to be wearing thin, and the past seeped through and mastered him for increasingly longer periods. He whose present had always been so bubbling that it crowded out past and future now found himself with a memory. In this new state, John begins to remember and visit old friends. His memories prompt him to confront Hattie, and even to deny that he ever married her. Of course, his memory is selective and self-serving and quite devastating to Hattie, but it does drive him to action. Even after Janie acquires the power of speech, which allows her to stand up to Jody, Hurston continues to objectify her so that she does not take action. Immediately after Jody's death, she goes to the looking glass where she tells us she has told her girl self to wait for her, and there she discovers that a handsome woman has taken her place. She tears off the kerchief Jody has forced her to wear and lets down her plentiful hair. The height, the length, the glory was there. She took careful stock of herself, then combed her hair and tied it back up again. In her first moment of independence, Janie is not seen as autonomous subject, but again as visual object, seeing herself, draping before herself that hidden mystery which attracts men and makes her superior to women. Note that when she turns to the mirror, it is not to experience her own sensual pleasure in her hair. She does not tell us how her hair felt to her. Did it tingle at the roots? Did she shiver with delight? No, she takes stock of herself, makes an assessment of herself. What's in the mirror that she cannot experience without it? That imaginary other whom the mirror represents, looking on in judgment, or recording not her own sensations, but the way others see her. Barbara Johnson's reading of Their Eyes suggests that once Janie is able to identify the split between her inside and outside selves, incorporating and articulating her own sense of self-division, she develops an increasing ability to speak. I have come to different conclusions. That Hurston continues to subvert Janie's voice, that in crucial places where we need her to speak, she is curiously silent, that even when Hurston sets out to explore Janie's internal consciousness, her internal speech, what we actually hear are the voices of men. Once Tea-Cake enters the narrative, his name and his voice are heard nearly twice as often as Janie's. He walks into Janie's life with a guitar and a grin and tells her, "Honey, since you lose me and give me privilege to tell you all about myself, I'll tell you." And from then on, it is Tea-Cake's tale. The only reason for Janie's account of her life to Phoebe being to vindicate Tea-Cake's name, insisting on Tea-Cake's innocence as well as his central place in her story. Janie tells Phoebe, "Tea-Cake ain't wasting no money on mine, and he ain't left me for no young girl neither. He give me every consolation in the world. He'd tell him so too if he was here, if he wasn't gone." As many feminist critics have pointed out, Women do get silenced, even in texts by women, and there are critical places in their eyes where Janie's voice needs to be heard and is not. Places where we would expect her, as the subject of the story, to speak. Perhaps the most stunning silence in the text occurs after Tea Cake beats Janie. The beating is seen entirely through the eyes of the male community, while Janie's reaction is never given. Tea Cake becomes the envy of the other men for having a woman whose flesh is so tender that one can see every place she's been hit. Suck the bottom, declares in awe. Wouldn't I love to whip a tender woman like Janie? Janie is silent, so thoroughly repressed in this section that all that remains of her is what Tea Cake and the other men desire. Passages which are supposed to represent Janie's interior consciousness begin by marking some internal change in Janie, then gradually or abruptly shift so that a male character takes Janie's place as the subject of the discourse. At the conclusion of these passages, ostensibly devoted to the revelation of Janie's interior life, the male voice predominates. Janie's life, just before and after Jodi's death, is a fertile period for such self-reflection, but Hurston does not focus the attention of the text on Janie, even in these significant turning points in Janie's life. In the long paragraph that tells us how she has changed in the 6 months after Jodi's death, we are told that Janie talked and laughed in the store at a time and was happy except for the store. To solve the problem of the store, she hires Hezekiah, who was the best imitation of Joe that his 17 years could make. At this point, the paragraph shifts its focus from Janie and her growing sense of independence to Hezekiah and his imitation of Jodi, describing Hezekiah in a way that evokes Jodi's presence and obliterates Janie. We are told at the end of the paragraph, in tongue-in-cheek humor, that because managing stores and women store owners was trying on a man's nerves, Hezekiah needed to take a drink of liquor now and then to keep up. Thus, Janie is not only removed as the subject of this passage, but is subsumed under the male-defined category of worrisome women. Even the much-celebrated description of Janie's discovery of her split selves, she had an inside and an outside now, and suddenly she knew how not to mix them, represents her internal life as divided between two men. Her outside self exists for Joe, and her inside self she is saving up for some man she has never seen. Critic Robert Steptoe was the first to raise the question about Janie's lack of voice in their eyes. In his critique of Afro-American narrative, he claims that Hurston creates only the illusion that Janie has achieved her voice, that Hurston's strategy of having much of Janie's tale told by an omniscient third person rather than by a first-person narrator undercuts the development of Janie's voice. While I was initially resistant to criticism of their eyes, my reading of Jonah's Gourd Vine suggests that Hurston was indeed ambivalent about giving a powerful voice to a woman like Janie, who is already in rebellion against male authority and against the roles prescribed for women in a male-dominated society. As Steptoe notes, Janie's lack of voice is particularly disturbing in the courtroom scene, which comes at the end of her tale and presumably at a point where she has developed her capacity to speak. Hurston tells us that down in the Everglades, she got so she would tell big stories herself. But in the courtroom scene, the story of Janie and Tea Cake is told entirely in third person. She had to go way back to let them know how she and Tea Cake had been with one another. We do not hear Janie speaking in her own voice until we return to the frame where she is speaking to her friend, Phoebe. There is a similar courtroom scene in Jonah's Gourd Vine, and there is also a silence, not an enforced silence, but the silence of a man who deliberately chooses not to speak, John is hauled into courtroom by his second wife, Hattie, on the grounds of adultery. Like the court system in their eyes, this too is one where the laws and the courthouses and the jailhouses all belong to white folks. And, as in Janie's situation, the black community is united against John. His former friends take the stand against him, testifying on Hattie's behalf in order to spite John, but John refuses to call any witnesses for his defense. After he has lost the trial, his friend Hambo angrily asks him why he didn't allow him to testify. John's eloquent answer explains his silence in the courtroom, but more than that, it shows that he has such power over his voice that he can choose when and where to use it. In this case, to defy a hypocritical racist system and to protect the black community. Quote, I didn't want the white folk to hear about nothing like that. They knows too much about us as it is, but some things they ain't to know. There's some strings on our heart for us to play on or sing to ourselves. They thinks we's all ignorant as it is, and they thinks we's all like, and that they knows us inside and out, but you know better. They wouldn't make no great migration if you hadn't told them how they had all them men's. They wouldn't zorn between us, women like Hattie and one like Lucy, and your wife before she died. They thinks all colored folks is the same like that way. End quote. John's deliberate silence is motivated by his political consciousness. In spite of the community's rejection of him, he is still their defender, especially in the face of common adversary. Hurston does not allow Janie the insight John has, nor the voice, nor the loyalty to her people. To Mrs. Turner's racial insults, Janie is nearly silent, offering only a cold shoulder to show her resistance to the woman's bigotry. In the courtroom scene, Janie is divorced from other blacks and surrounded by a protecting wall of white women. She is vindicated and the black community humbled. Janie is the outsider. John is the culture's hero, their inspired artiste, the traditional male hero in possession of traditional male power. But John's power in the community and his gift for words do not always serve him well. As Robert Hemingway asserts in his critical biography of Hurston, John is a captive of the community's need for a public giver of words. Quote, his language does not serve to articulate his personal problems because it is directed away from the self toward the communal celebration. John, the man of words, becomes the victim of his bardic function. He is the epic poet of the community who sacrifices himself for the group vision. End quote. For John, words mean power and status rather than the expression of feeling. When he first discovers the power of his voice, he thinks immediately of how good he sounds and how his voice can be exploited for his benefits. Quote, that show sound good. If my voice sound that good the first time I ever prayed in the church house, it sure won't be the last. End quote. John never feels the call to preach until the day on Joe Clark's porch when the men tease John about being a wife-made man. One of his buddies tells him that with a wife like Lucy, any man could get ahead in life. Anybody could put himself on the ladder with her in the house. The following Sunday, in his continuing quest for manhood and power, John turns to preaching. The dramatic quality of his preaching and his showmanship easily made him the most famous preacher and the most powerful man in the area. John's inability to achieve maturity and his sudden death at the moment of his greatest insight suggest a great deal about Hurston's discomfort with the traditional male hero, with the values of the community he represents, with the culture's privileging of orality over inward development. Janie Starks is almost the complete antithesis I can't say that word. Janie Starks is the most Janie Starks is almost the complete mm, antithesis. Janie Starks is the most complete antithesis of John Pearson. She assumes heroic stature not by externals, but by her own struggle for self definition, for autonomy, for liberation from the illusions that others have tried to make her live by or that she has submitted to herself. While Janie's culture honors the oral art, this picture making with words, Janie's final speech in their eyes actually casts doubt on the relevance of oral speech. Quote, talking don't amount to a hill of beans when you can't do nothing else. Phoebe, you got to go there to know there. Your papa and your mama and nobody else can tell you and show you. Two things everybody's got to do for themselves. They got to go to God and they got to find out about living for themselves. End quote. Jenny's final comment that experience is more important than words is an implicit criticism of the culture that celebrates orality to the exclusion of inner growth. The language of men in their eyes and in Jonah's gourd vine is almost always divorced from any kind of interiority. The men are rarely shown in the process of growth. Their talking is a game. Janie's life is about the experience of relationships. Logan, Jody, and Tea Cake and John Pearson are essentially static characters, whereas Phoebe and Janie allow experience to change them. John, who seems almost constitutionally unfitted for self-examination, is killed at the end of the novel by a train, the very symbol of male power he has seduced by all of his life. Vladimir Propp, in his study of folklore and narrative, cautions us not to think that plots directly reflect a given social order, but rather emerge out of the conflict, the contradictions of different social orders as they succeed or replace one another. What is manifested in the tensions of plots is the difficult coexistence of different orders of historical reality in the long period of transition from one to another. Hurston's plots may very well reflect such a tension in the social order, a period of transition in which the conflictual coexistence of a predominantly male and a more egalitarian culture is inscribed in these two forms of culture heroes. Both novels end in an ambiguous stance. John dies alone, so dominated by the ideals of his community that he is completely unable to understand his spiritual dilemma, and Janie, having returned to the community she once rejected, is left in a position of interiority, so total it seems to represent another structure of confinement. Alone in her bedroom, she watches pictures of love and light against the walls, almost as though she is a spectator at a film. She pulls in the horizon and drapes it over her shoulder and calls in her soul to come and see. The language of this section gives us the illusion of growth and development, but the language is deceptive. The horizon represents the outside world, the world of adventure where Janie journeyed in search of people and a value system that would allow her real self to shine. If the horizon is the world of possibility, of journeys, of meeting new people and eschewing materialistic values, then Janie seems to be canceling out any further exploration of that world. In Eatonville, she is a landlady with a fat bank account and a scorn for the people that ensures her alienation. Like the heroine of romantic fiction, left without a man, she exists in a position of a stasis with no suggestion of how she will employ her considerable energies in her now, perhaps temporarily, manless life. Hurston was obviously comfortable with the role of the traditional male hero in Jonah's gourd vine, but their eyes presented Hurston with a problem she could not solve, the questing hero as woman. That Hurston intended Janie to be such a hero, at least on some level, is undeniable. She puts Janie on the track of autonomy, self-realization, and independence. She allows her to put on the outward trappings of male. She allows her to put on the outward trappings of male power. Janie dresses in overalls, goes on the muck, learns to shoot, even better than tea cake, and her rebellion changes her and potentially lead and her rebellion changes her and potentially her friend Phoebe. If the rightful end of the romantic heroine is marriage, then Hurston has certainly resisted the script of romance by having Janie kill Tea Cake, though he exists in death in a far more mythical and exalted way than in life, as Rachel Blau de Plessis argues, when the narrative resolves itself in the repression of romance and the reassertion of quest, the result is a narrative that is critical of those patriarchal rules that govern women and deny them a role outside of the boundaries of patriarchy. While such a critique of patriarchal norms is obvious in their eyes, we still see Hurston's ambivalence about Janie's role as hero as opposed to heroine. Like all romantic heroines, Janie follows the dreams of men. She takes off after Jody because he spoke for far horizon, and she takes off after Tea Cake's dream of going on the muck. By the rules of romantic fiction, the heroine is extremely feminine in looks. Janie's long, heavy, Caucasian-like hair is mentioned so many times in their eyes that, as one of my students said, it becomes another character in the novel, a hidden mystery. Janie's hair is one of the most powerful forces in her life, mesmerizing men and alienating the women. As a trope straight out of the turn-of-the-century mulatto novel, Clotel, Iola, Leroy, The House Behind the Cedars. The hair connects Janie inexorably to the conventional romantic heroine. Employing other standard devices of romantic fiction, Hurston creates the excitement and tension of romantic seduction. Tea Cake, a tall, dark, mysterious stranger, strides into the novel and wrenches Janie away from her prim and proper life. The age and class differences between Janie and Tea Cake, the secrecy of their affair, the town's disapproval, the sense of risk and helplessness as Janie discovers passionate love, and the fear, desire, and even the potential violence of becoming the possessed are all standard features of romance fiction. Janie is not the subject of these romantic episodes. She is the object of Tea Cake's quest, subsumed under his desires, and at times so subordinate to Tea Cake that even her interior consciousness reveals more about him than it does about her. In spite of his infidelities, his arrogance, and his incapacity for self-reflection, John Pearson is unambiguously the heroic center of Jonah's gourd vine. He inhabits the entire text. His voice is heard on nearly every page. He follows his own dreams. He is selected by the community to be its leader and is recognized by the community for his powers and chastised for his shortcomings. The preacher's sermon, as he eulogized John at his funeral, is not so much a tribute to the man as it is a recognition that the narrative exists to assert the power of the male story and its claim to our attention. Janie has, of course, reformed her community simply by her resistance to its values. The very fact of her status as outsider makes her seem heroic by contemporary standards, unable to achieve the easy integration into the society that John Pearson assumes. She stands on the outside and calls into question her culture's dependence on externals, its lack of self-reflection, and its treatment of women. Her rebellion changes her and her friend Phoebe, and, in the words of Lee Edwards, her life becomes a compelling model of possibility for anyone who hears her tale.